All right. Welcome, friends. Welcome back. If you've been with us before or if you're joining us for the first time, we are thrilled to have you. This is our Q&A series, Going Deeper, where we get to sit down with some of our pastors and our staff here at Mount Rainier Christian Center and dive a little bit more into our sermon series that we get to hear on Sunday mornings and ask some questions that we don't really get the chance to do over the course of a Sunday morning. So this morning we've got Pastor Greg with us, and we're going to be discussing the sermon Promises, which is the first of a new series that we're starting, just a short little series that we're going to be talking about the gospel and some common misconceptions and just get a better understanding of what's there. So the idea that we learn in this sermon is that grace is a promise from God to us, not a deal that we make with him. And it's a relational thing. So the first question, we go over John chapter 3, verse 18 in the sermon, where we hear that whoever believes in Jesus is saved, but whoever doesn't believe is condemned.
Yeah.
Now, if someone had spent their whole life never having heard of Jesus, would they be unable to believe and thus be condemned? How would God interact with or judge that person?
Yeah, it's a great question, Brent, and it's kind of a timely question because we live in a time when, our culture is kind of post-Christian in many ways. There was a lot of mutual understandings that are not there anymore. Really the inspiration for the whole series is that we have kind of lost touch with that kernel of truth at the heart of the gospel that makes all the difference. And that is that we are sinners who need a Savior, right? We're not accustomed to thinking of ourselves as sinners. But that's because we misunderstand the whole idea. The bottom line is that all of us know that none of us are perfect. I mean, we all know that, right? But where we fall short of what God is revealing to us is that we tend to say to ourselves, imperfection doesn't really matter because nobody's perfect. But God says, no, absolutely it matters, because at the end of the day, the only way we can realize our yearning for human community the way it should be is within the standards that God knows are necessary for that shared sense of peace and justice and love and harmony. So, the gospel is about God saying, hey, you're broken, Greg, but I have the solution and the cure, and it's freely given. All you have to do is be willing to receive it. The first step to receiving, of course, is admitting that I need it. So really, that's at the heart of the gospel. But when we get to that point, where people tend to think is that we make a deal with God, right? God comes along and says, hey, perfection is the standard. You fall short of it. And then it's as if we enter into a contract where I do my part, he does his part. But that's a fundamental misunderstanding. What the gospel tells us and what Jesus was saying in that passage is that, salvation, that is being reconciled to God as well as reconciled to one another, is not a thing where I do my part, God does his part. God does all of it, right? I simply receive it, So he gives me something. We talk later in the sermon about how salvation is a free gift. But the gift is like medicine in the sense that I've got to be willing to receive it. So God gives the gospel, beginning with Abraham, in the inside of the context of a promise. And until we grasp that it's a free gift offered inside of a promise, then we constantly think, how do I make a deal with God where we each hold up our end of the bargain? And of course, the joy of the gospel is that God holds up all ends of the bargain and we receive that free grace. So that's the idea, promise and a deal.
So then would God, would that promise, is that extended to those who have never even heard of Jesus? Oh,
absolutely, yeah. So as I forgot you asked that. So Romans chapter 2 tells us that people are only responsible for what has been revealed to them, for what they know, and that God judges on the basis of what we know. But here's the important thing. We know a lot more than we think we do. Yeah. We all know deep in our own hearts that we have fallen short, not only in the sense of doing things we shouldn't, but of not doing things we should. And we've got to be willing to take that seriously. C.S. Lewis writes about the law of human nature or the moral law. All of us know there's right and wrong. Yeah. We like to argue about it because sometimes we think it's in our self-interest to argue about it. But God says, no. This is real. This matters. Your sin really affects you first and foremost. By the way, God doesn't hate sin because it breaks his rules. He hates sin because of what it does to us, right? Yep. And then he says, this is a big deal. We've got to solve this, Greg. If we don't solve this, where it's going to lead you is to a pretty awful place. The person who's never heard the gospel in its formal expression is nevertheless in their hearts responsible to God for saying, wow, I'm a sinner. I need God's mercy and grace and forgiveness, and I need to be saved. And Romans is at pains to tell us in chapter 1 that all people know this, but we don't like to admit it to ourselves, and we certainly don't like to admit it to anybody else.
Yeah.
And that's where the challenge comes, right?
We spend a lot of effort and energy trying to warp or sort of
Avoid
the truth, right? That even if we do understand it.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on, the next question. You mentioned in the sermon that relating to John chapter 3, verse 19, light has come into the world, but men loved darkness. In that lots of people like the idea of God, but don't really want God specifically.
Yeah.
Could you maybe expound a little bit on what you meant by that? Can you give us maybe an example of how someone who thinks like that might act?
Oh, you bet. We were all kids once upon a time, right? And when I was 10, I thought I wanted my parents to give certain permissions and be lenient about certain things. Certainly I wanted that by the time I was 13, 14, 15, right? I thought I wanted them to let me have my way. What I discovered as I grew and matured is that some of the best gifts they ever gave me was when I didn't get my way, right? Yeah. So I thought I wanted this generic parent who, stayed in the background. But in fact, what I learned was that, no, I needed much more than that, and I would be benefited by much more than that. So unless God becomes specific to us, right? First of all, we're never going to know that we're sinners. But second of all, we're never going to know how much he loves us. And we're never going to realize that his grace is exactly what we need. So what Jesus is saying in that passage is, hey, I want to reveal God to you, but he's just like me. In fact, I'm him in human flesh. So if you want something else, you're rejecting me.
Yeah.
And if I'm the light of the world and you reject light, there's only darkness.
Got it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, moving on. We learn this truth in the sermon that sin is like a cancer of the soul, sort of this illustration that will kill us if we aren't healed of it. Kind of goes back to what you're saying, that God hates sin because of what it does to us, right?
Yes.
Not because of any sort of, his view on it. So here's a question I'm sure many of us are always curious about. If God is all powerful, right, why can't he just erase sin from the world? Sure. Why can't he just make it go away and make everything go back to sort of the perfect way that it was before?
Well, it's a great question, Brennan. Who hasn't asked that, right? But in fact, what that betrays is an essential misunderstanding of the nature of a human being. See, we're made in God's image. And while that's a metaphor in the biblical creation account, it reflects a concrete reality, and that is that we have a mind, the ability to choose, a will. And once God decides to make space for choice, for will, then he has to make space for bad choices and bad will. If he takes away choice, we can't love. Love ultimately has to be freely given, or it's not love. And so when God creates human beings, he makes us in his image. So what that's telling us is that our nature is very great. We, like God, can choose. And that is a sobering, profound realization. C.S. Lewis again points out that while everything else in nature is bound by the laws of nature, human beings are unique in that we aren't. We can choose. We can know something is right. We can know we should do something and choose not to. A stone, a tree can't do that. And obviously the animal kingdom has a much more restricted capacity for that. Yes. But we can choose to do whatever we want. That feels like a great weight because it is. The reality is that there's a wonderful little detail in the creation account that most people miss. And that is that after Adam and Eve sinned and were exiled from the garden, the scripture says God put an angel there with a flaming sword so they couldn't get back in. And the reason he did that was he didn't want them to eat from the tree of life. Again, a picture of having eternal existence apart from being corrected in my spirit, my heart, being redeemed and saved. Well, that's because the most horrible thing in the world would be to have this eternal life without being good. In fact, let's say that in my lifetime, again, I'm borrowing from Lewis, if in my lifetime, my temper is only getting a little worse, then over 60, 70, 80 years, it might not be super noticeable. But what about after 8 million years?
Yeah.
Or 8 billion years? If my temper has only been getting a little bad that long, I'm a monster, right? And so, the gospel recognizes that and says, hey, Greg, You need a healing at the deepest level of who you are, which can only come first through being forgiven, right? But ultimately through being parented by God freely, where I surrender to it, I give to it, I say, okay, I'm gonna learn from you, and so that's what lies at the heart of the gospel.
It's kind of sobering to think that in the amount of time that we've existed here on this earth in our short lifetimes, as bad as things get in that window that we see, looking at a bigger picture of what would happen if that were extended out over.
Incredibly humbling. You know, Chesterton pointed out that the problem with the secular humanist, the person who kind of wants to resist the idea that we're made or created by God, is not that they make too much of human nature. Is that they make too little. Yeah. They don't recognize that we're going to last forever. And so everything looks different in that context. And there you go.
For sure. All right. Moving towards our home stretch here, we move on to talk about the distinction between a promise and a deal, right? Yeah. And that a promise, like the one that God offers us, is dependent on him, right? Instead of being a deal that has both sides contractually obligated. It might look like, especially to those who are on the outside who don't really understand Christianity as a whole, it might seem like there are a bunch of rules and restrictions, and it might look to many that it still is sort of an exchange or a deal of sorts. Is that maybe a result of like church culture or how we've portrayed the church? Have we missed in that respect as the Big C church? Like what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think first and foremost, that kind of way of thinking about things, that misunderstanding, it just derives from human nature. I resist the idea that I need your help. Yeah. And all of us kind of resist the idea that someone else must do something for us. We like to think we can do it ourselves. Yeah. But ultimately there are times when we can't. I just had a major shoulder surgery from a motorcycle wreck a little bit ago. Well, my doctor came to me and says, "You need a shoulder surgery, Greg," right? Now at that point I had a choice to make. Either I was going to submit to that or I was going to resist that. Now, I don't have a part to play in the surgery. You know what I did during the surgery? I laid there in a bad gown, right? Yep. He did everything, right? But I had to be willing to receive it. I had to say, okay, right? Yeah. I'm going to come in. Now, you talked about it seeming like his deal. Well, there's a sense in which I said, I'm going to go lay on the table and trust you and put on a gown and, agree to have medication administered. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
But that's merely the act of receiving.
Yeah, I think the power that's happening is all coming from
all
the
on
other
his
end.
Yeah, and it's the same with God. So when we come to Him because it's a promise in the context of receiving a gift freely given. That's all we're really doing. We're saying, I'm willing to receive that.
So, absolutely. Okay, so moving on to our next question here. We hear that the law was given. It exists to show us that we need grace, right? It points out to us that it points to the promise. Yeah. And the law isn't something we should discard, right? Because obeying God's commands brings a lot of blessing. Mm-hmm. There's blessing in that. So are the 10 Commandments sort of all encompassing of the law as God is concerned? Or are a lot of like the Levitical laws and the other things we see in Old Testament, are those still applicable? How do we know?
That's a great question, Brent. So in a nutshell, okay, think of the 10 Commandments as being statutes, right? Our legal system in the modern world consists of statutes and case law. Statutes are principles, case law are applications of the principles. So the 10 Commandments are the statutes, all right? They are the core of God's expectations of us. Really, again, He gives the law to us so that we can discover where we fall short of it, right? And once it's done that, it has achieved its primary purpose by leading us to Christ. But then, of course, once we trade the law for a Lord, which is what we do in our Christian faith, now we have the one who wrote the statutes. So the expectations are the same, but they're in a new context of promise rather than deal, right? So that's the idea, yeah. Now, you talk about the Levitical and the Deuteronomic law. All of those apply, but remember that those are applications, the case law, applied to specific circumstances. So when we relate to the Old Testament law, for example, what we need to do is find out what it meant then and then look for an equivalent in our current setting. A quick example I'll give you, the Levitical law tells us that we're supposed to build a parapet 2 feet high around our roof. Well, what's that got to do with anything? Well, once you understand that in that culture, family get-togethers were done on the roof. The roof was a kind of backyard patio, and that small children would be present at it. What God was saying is make your house safe for small children, right? And so, okay, well, what would be a modern context? Well, hey, if you're going to have toddlers over, put those little inserts in the light sockets, move the breakables, because, God calls us to not only not do bad things, but to seek to prevent bad things from happening. And so, when we look at that law, we're looking at applications, which is why, as an aside, I don't want to give too long an answer, but as an aside, God comes to us in Acts and through that vision that Peter had, says, hey, the dietary laws are no longer central because their primary purpose was a revelation then, and now, eat whatever you want, And so why? Because, in this current modern application of the statute, it's less significant.
So much like how today we would look back on like that parapet law and we would say, oh, that's kind of a no-brainer, but they needed that back then.
Yes.
It would be the same as if we went over to our parents' house now and they'd set up bumpers for us and we're adults. It's like, well, we don't need this anymore, but what are the things that they do now for us that mean the same, that come from the same heart?
Brent, that's a really great point, because what God was revealing, the purpose of the law is revelation, what God was revealing to Israel was that making the safety of children a priority is a big deal.
Yeah.
And that we should arrange our homes, our society to make children safe, right?
Yeah.
So then we just say, oh, okay, that's God's heart. Now, how do we apply that principle in our modern context?
Yes,
Yeah.
Got it. All right, wrapping up with our last little short question here. Romans 7 says, and we look at this towards the end of the sermon, sin, seizing every opportunity afforded by the commandment, produced in me every kind of covetous desire. Now, reading this, it might seem that sin is sort of acting independent of us as its own sort of agent here, almost as though we're victims of sin. Is that how it is? Are we victims of sin? Are we the sin ourselves? How does that work?
No, that's a great question. So what the Bible tells us is that we have a sinful nature. That means a proclivity to sin and a disinclination to live in submission and respect and love for God. So it's kind of a both and situation, right? So Paul wants us to understand in that Romans 7 passage that there is something in us that doesn't want to do what God says. Now, anybody who's had a toddler knows what that looks like, right? And everybody who's been a teenager knows what that looks like. So as soon as somebody says don't do something, we immediately say, well, why? Well, sometimes the don't is more important than the why, or the do is more important than the why. So, but the sinful nature resists that. Now, one little addendum to that point is that Paul's going to go on in that chapter and say that when we become Christians, we don't immediately lose that sinful nature. It remains there. But we're no longer held responsible for everything that it does. So Paul's going to say, if I do what I don't want to do, it's no longer I who do it, it's sin living in me. What he's saying is that's our old nature wrestling with our new nature. So the Christian life is not actually the end of struggle and conflict. It's the beginning, because for the first...
Now we're actually fighting.
Right. Yeah. Now we're actually trying to do good. And by the way, nothing will humble you about your own nature faster than when you really try to do good at a high level. Oh my goodness. Then suddenly you go, I am a sinner. I need a Savior.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, fantastic stuff. To close out the show, as we always do, if you could leave folks with one short encouragement or reminder to focus on from this sermon, what would you say?
Yeah, I feel like I'm going to say something I've said before, but that's the gospel, right? Of course. It's only let us live up to what we've already attained, Philippians 3:16, because God gives us his grace via a promise. We receive it and we don't immediately live up to it. We have to learn how to live up to it. Sometimes we have to train ourselves to live up to it, but because it's a promise, not a deal, we've already received the reality. Now it's just a matter of learning to walk in it. So, only let us live up to what we've already attained. We have salvation through God's promise to do what I can't for myself. And now we just live up to that. We grow into that.
Fantastic. Well, that's all for this episode, folks. If you have any questions or thoughts as you're listening to the sermons or as you're here on a Sunday morning, we would love to hear from you. If you want to submit any questions, we'd love to maybe do an episode or two of these every so often where we address some questions that maybe you guys submit. So if you have any questions, shoot them our way. We'd love to see those and address them. But for now, thanks so much for watching, and we will see you next time.